Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday session. There's a few extra people still filtering in, so I might just say thanks for joining us before the long weekend. I know it's a big break and we'll have a lot of extra spare time, which I hope we'll all be able to use productively. We've got a lot of really interesting speakers in today's session, so I might get the ball rolling quickly, which is first, I just think we acknowledge country at the beginning of any kind of meeting, and I think it's even more important to do today, especially given many of us are on so many different lands. So firstly, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. I'm on the Duck and John country at the moment. Normally I'm in Gadigal country. I live in Sydney, but I'm visiting my family during this odd period. And I want to recognise traditional owners' continuing connection to land, waters and culture across the territorial Australia, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. The next thing I'd say is, hi, my name's Daniel. I work at a company called Principal Co that does a lot of like campaigns work. I'm sure many of you have come across me in that time. And I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to what Australia at Home is. I think a lot of you have joined us before, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming along to these sessions. I think they've been really enriching and really helpful. But essentially, a group of us, including Essential, The Guardian, Centre for Australian Progress, the Community Council for Australia, the Australian Climate Foundation, and a few other smaller NGOs thought this is a weird period. We're all feeling a bit isolated, and especially a couple of weeks ago, everyone was in this real state of panic and uncertainty about what the future looked like. And we wanted to kind of create a space to bring all of the people in our broader community together to think a bit more longer term, and to reflect on some of the challenges we were having. And I think really importantly, to see a bit further afield than just what we can see from our bedroom windows. I think that the real challenge with this is that with all of us kept in our homes, it really exacerbates some of the blinkers, some of the limiting awareness we all have even in our ordinary lives, but it really makes it a lot more severe. We're depending on the media and depending on people within our social network to tell us what's happening across the country, and that naturally has a lot of limits. And that's really, I think, some of the kind of philosophy or the context we bring to these sessions, and especially sessions like this one today, where we've got a wonderfully diverse range of speakers who I'll now quickly introduce. So to start with, we've got the fantastic Senator Malarndirri McCarthy from the Northern Territory, who's been doing a lot of work all across the Territory. But I'll leave that for her to speak to exactly what that looks like. We've also got Larissa Baldwin, who's been working with GetUp and a number of other kind of younger Indigenous organisations, done a lot of work in the environment movement as well, and is a wonderful leading voice within like the kind of younger set of folk. And also I don't want to skip past Ani June, who works with the I forgot, it's the Regional Disability Council, I think. I possibly got that wrong, network, and has been doing a lot of work with people who are really directly affected in regional New South Wales. And I think I'm really looking forward to hearing from June, because as I said, I feel like my perspective has been really limited by the institutions and the communities I'm a part of. So I think there's a couple of ground rules I wanted to touch on before we kind of got everything underway, and I'll shut up. I plan on not talking very much in this session. We're recording this session to share with everybody later who can't make it. So just, I guess, be mindful of that. And also, if that's an issue for you, just let one of our wonderful tech helpers in the chat know. We'll also aim to try and keep people on mute while we're talking. So that's just to kind of make sure we're not having hundreds of different voices, but we do really, really want you to be able to kind of contribute and end up in conversation. So the way we've been doing that over the last few days that have worked really well is put your questions and thoughts in the chat. There's usually a really big active chat that runs alongside these sessions. And what we'll be doing is keeping an eye on them. And at the end of some of the introductory kind of comments from each of our speakers, we'll then call a few people forward to speak. So yeah, please post questions, thoughts, comments, reflections in the chat, because not only are they useful as part of the chat, but also we really want you to be able to like step forward and pose questions to the broader group, and to explore things a bit more deeply. We also really, really encourage you to keep your videos on. I think lots and lots of you have done that, which is so wonderful. If you haven't, no pressure. I know some of you might be, in in bedrooms or wherever, but I think it's so nice to see other faces, to feel like you're part of a big group. Switch to gallery view too if you haven't done that already. And even just be exposed to the ordinariness of all of our lives. No one's in fancy offices. We all have fairly ordinary looking homes, but that's itself kind of comforting. So to introduce the kind of topic, there's been no shortage of coverage about COVID. It's completely dominated our national conversation for nearly a month now. It's transformed the ways we interact with and think about government and the ways we interact and think about everything in our lives. But little has been published which explores its impact when it comes to First Nations people. And I think that's an enormous limiter. At this time of challenge, it's never been more important to make sure we're seeing those diverse perspectives. Especially because we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities often live in quite remote environments and are at much greater risk of coronavirus, partly because of existing chronic disease and illness, overcrowded houses, under-resourced health services, all sorts of problems that just make this situation much, much worse for these communities. But it isn't just a community being faced in the regions. It isn't just a challenge being faced in the regions. This remains a challenge for First Nations people, whether they're in suburbia, in the city, or wherever they might be. And so I'm going to start by just quickly asking a 2-minute quick response question to each of our speakers, which I think has been a nice thing we've done with each of our sessions, which is, and I'll start with you, Malarndirri. How are you going? How are you feeling in this weird time?
Look, just feeling very hopeful, I think, Daniel, that we're going to get through, and we need to get through this together. It's also very, up here in the Northern Territory in particular, it's a very quiet time. We've had a couple of weeks of real panic and concern and relocation and movement of people, and then more recently establishing roadblocks. So there seems to be a bit more of a calming in terms of the systemic changes. But in terms of people, I think there's a lot more sense of loneliness, a bit of the isolation and the reality of what's going on. And maybe, some of the mental health issues are really coming to the fore. So we've got to just look out for one another.
100% agree. Larissa, how are you feeling?
I feel like I have my up and down days. I think there's working in First Nations space right now is incredibly challenging. There's a lot of work is like incredibly long hours. Talking to people across the country, this is a lot of what my day consists of and what's going on for people. But I think, as people in positions that are working and responding to this crisis right now, like, we're not immune for it through our own families. And I have an old father who's in hospital, and, being situated in Brisbane and I've never experienced this kind of isolation away from my family. And I think that's been incredibly hard for us as well. We're kind of all in each other's lives, and this is a really weird and strange period. And it's a scary period to have sick parents or parents with chronic illness right now as well. So, yeah, trying to look out for each other and trying to be that positive for each other, but it is a strange place to be in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And June, can I call upon you as well? Which you're from the First Peoples Disability Network. Sorry, I mangled that before. Yeah. Oh, have we got you, June? Oh, I think you're still on mute. Let me just unmute you for you. Hey, there we are, mute. How are you feeling, June?
I'm personally okay, but, as Larissa and the others have said, it's quite an intense time. I mean, for us as an organisation, we've probably been working more than ever because, all the concerns that we've had for the last 20 years are now coming to fruition where, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability have never been supported appropriately. The service sector has never been there for them. So, all the stories that we've said for a long time are now coming home, and, and now it's our time to, put this reflection out there and make government start talking about it. We're not hearing anything from government around disability, and that's a real disappointment for us. So, collectively with the coalition of Disability Peaks and the disability rights movement, we're trying to put papers out there and letters to government to, you know, of our concerns of those most vulnerable at this stage.
Yeah, that makes sense. I look forward to hearing a lot more about that. To begin with, Malarndirri, I might go to you and kind of open the floor and pose a pretty broad question to you, which is, early on in this crisis, Aboriginal leaders like Pat Turner and organisations like the Central Land Council called for restrictions on access to remote communities. In your view, why is it so important to keep the virus out of remote communities?
Well, you know, that was an important call by the Aboriginal leaders across the territory in the land councils, the Aboriginal Community Health Control, and also Pat Turner as the chair or CEO of NACCHO. But can I just say, Daniel, from the outset, that, you know, this pandemic has exposed our country's cataclysmic failure in terms of closing the gap. Nowhere has it been more profound than in this moment of unprecedented crisis, where the failure to have good homes, housing for enough people, to have access to digital technology so that kids can learn from home if they have to learn from home, which in this case they do right across many states and territories. Certainly our health, as we all know, is nowhere near where it should be. And as a result, there are incredibly drastic measures to block the borders to ensure that people don't get in. And the fact that essential services, that these communities don't even have that. And so what this epidemic is highlighting to such a degree is the lack of failure over decades of our country in its inability to bring equality to First Nations people in this country. And that, Daniel, I think is the key underlying factor in all of this, that we've got to get through this, and we will get through this. But let me tell you, there has to be an earthquake shake in all the policies that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. Even the Torres Strait Island mob are concerned because you've got Papua New Guinea people who are so close with Saibai. Where is the care and concern, not only for the Torres Strait, but even for all those mob over there who come across and use their health facilities? I mean, this is where broader Australia needs to realise that unless we bring all people with us, and in this case, First Nations people, people with disabilities, our elders, we are not going to get through it. But thankfully, I think culturally, we are a resilient people, and we are determined to get through this, irrespective of that deficiency.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess just when thinking about the porousness of a lot of these communities, I understand that these restrictions have been introduced through the Commonwealth Biosecurity Act. How is that actually being implemented in the NT? What does that mean on the ground for people living in these remote communities?
Yeah, sure. Look, if I could just paint a picture for people who may not be familiar with the Northern Territory, where once you could just drive from Alice Springs all the way up to Darwin and not be stopped, and you could drive, get in your car and take off. You could get in your car from Timber Creek on the west side of the border and come to Katherine. You can't do that now. With the biosecurity laws, if you land in Alice Springs today, you are going to be taken immediately to a hotel, not of your choice, a hotel where you will have to pay for 14 days. And then when you're cleared, you may be able to move around Alice Springs. But if you're in Yuendamu or Hermannsburg, or if you're in any of the Arnhem Land communities and you want to go into Alice Springs or go into Katherine, if you're in Arnhem, you will be stopped, because you will be checked to see if you have the appropriate paperwork. And that is what this biosecurity legislation is all about. But having said that, Daniel, this was what the land councils across the Northern Territory and the Aboriginal leaders called for, because they needed to protect the communities from people coming from outside in. So what it means is that you can't, there's not freedom of movement across the Northern Territory in this particular, at this particular time.
Yeah, I can imagine that's extremely difficult, given that, you know, from my visits to the region, you know, there's not really a clear marker, like everything's a social cultural border.
Well, but it's more than that, Daniel. It's not even cultural. It's there's a mental, you know, we're all, as Australians, even just, we travel wherever we want. You know, we heard Larissa say she can't even be with her family. And that sense of, wow, I can't contact, you know, my family. That's, I think all Australians feel that. But the difference here is that, and this is what we have to watch, is that we've got to make sure that the intent behind this legislation goes good, in a good way, and make sure it doesn't go down a dark path, which it could very easily do if we are not vigilant on every level, every day, about how it's operating.
I guess another kind of follow-up question on that, before I turn to questions from the audience, so please pop some of them in if you've got thoughts, is you've obviously been very connected to what's been brewing in Canberra as a response to all of this. Do you, like, kind of, what are your impressions about some of these stimulus packages? Do they make enough of a difference when it comes to not even necessarily First Nations people, but just people who are living in remote and regional areas?
Sure, for regional remote Australians, but look, for all Australians, I mean, you know, let's be frank, I don't want to see any person out of a job, you know, and I certainly don't want to see people who went to work today suddenly told by the afternoon you no longer can be in a job because because we've got to cut this business off. So naturally, we want all Australians to have access to being cared for, to get through this crisis. It's not just about getting through it in a health way. We've got to be mentally able to cope with it and get through it. We've got to be able to know in terms of access to food, to continue payments of whatever bills we may have, also just the essential services of power and water, just having your mobile phone and connection. These are the sort of standards of living that most Australians expect and would like to continue in a crisis. And I think the stimulus package, it did take a while to get there, but I am pleased to see that most Australians can access it. We would have obviously liked more in terms of casuals and in terms of people on visa. We wanted to make sure that all people who are in the country affected are treated with dignity and respect.
100%. I might call on Nicola Paris to step forward, who just posted a really interesting question in the chat. So if we can just unmute you, and then Nicola, do you want to pose that question to the group?
Sure. Sorry, I thought that a bunch of people would be dumping stuff in there. I didn't want to go first necessarily. Yeah, so I'm interested in the use of the army. I've just come off the back of another call that's looking at civil liberties and police overreaching and stuff like that. So interested in the use of the army in the NT and elsewhere, and how much say mob have got over if and how they're used, and obviously in the context of what happened with the NT intervention and stuff like that.
Sure. Thanks, Nicola. Look, I'm always very careful of the fact that under pieces of legislation you can have your rights removed immediately. And in this instance, with the Biosecurity Act, I'm certainly saying to people across the Northern Territory, in particular First Nations or vulnerable people wherever they are, to contact me. And they are. People are contacting me constantly. My staff are working with those calls and emails that come through, whether it's to do with police road checks and roadblocks, the way people are being treated, whether it's questions around their basics card and the fact that they can't renew or get a new basics card because Centrelink's shut in their community and therefore they can't access any funds to purchase food. So these calls are constantly coming to my office. I am very, very aware of those issues that you raised, Nicola, and I think, as I said probably in my opening, that if anything, this pandemic has highlighted our country's cataclysmic failure in caring for First Nations people to the point of every aspect of life, health, education, housing, digital economy and access to good digital network, all of those things, and jobs. So look, for all those people listening, keep communicating with me. Let me know how you're going, because I certainly don't want to see this Biosecurity Act go down a path that is too dark to get back from.
Yeah, absolutely. I might now turn, we're going to have more time for open Q&A at the end of the session, but I might turn to Larissa Baldwin now. And so, Larissa, I know that you've been doing a lot of work over the, and I've had the privilege of having a few conversations with you over the last 6 months that, about a bunch of work you've been doing to put First Nations work on the national agenda generally. How has that been shaped in response to COVID? And I guess, what is your analysis or assessment about where things are standing?
I think, like, first of all, I want to say that, you know, right now, what's really happening in Aboriginal communities, this is a remote, regional, or whether you're in urban centres like cities and stuff like that, is that really the people that are leading on the front lines of caring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are our own people. We are the first line of responders to our communities, and we deeply understand the issues that are being faced. And I think for me, working in an organisation like GetUp, where we're, you know, there's a massive amount of people and outpouring around the viral kindness and this sort of stuff, and people just like, what do people need? To me, it's really stark to talk to any Aboriginal person, any Torres Strait Islander person who can just tell you exactly what the essential needs of people are right now in the communities. Like, we understand our communities. And I think when we talk about, you know, the biosecurity laws coming in and locking down communities, like, there was a number of communities that actually reached out first and were saying, we're going to lock down our communities. And I also just like, we're safest on country away from the virus and in isolation, we know that, but we're also safest on country because our communities they are providing the care that we need, and we can trust that our communities will provide and listen. And I think for people in positions like me and Malarndirri and Auntie June, we have been inundated with people being like, this thing is happening to me, and just needing to talk to people all constantly about what they're experiencing, and really needing to remain vigilant, because we know that there are measures in place right now that could go badly. And it's like, I think we don't have, I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about how Scott Morrison had said, you know, trust us to take care of you. And they're like, what a joke. When have we ever been able to trust you to take care of us? We take care of ourselves. But we have to be vigilant and make sure that we're aware of what is happening in our communities right now, because people are worried. There is an enormous task of work for community leaders right now, and the governments have been really slow on all levels to respond to the needs of peak organisations, advocacy, lead organisations on the ground, and they need to respond. I think there are a lot of people right now that are experiencing, rightfully, that the government is, you know, creating a stimulus for people who have never really potentially ever received this kind of assistance from government, and that's good, but there are people who are being left behind right now. And among that, right across the country, we are seeing our communities overrepresented and not being given things that they are asking for that they critically need right now.
I know you kind of touched on this a little bit in those comments, but do you have a sense about what some of those things might be? Like, what if there was something that people could take from this call and kind of ask their elected representatives to take action on? You know, what would some of those things look like?
I mean, I think Auntie June said it before, like, and I even seen a press conference with Auntie Pat Turner, and they were just like, we're asking for the same things we've been asking for decades. Like, this crisis has exposed all the holes and, like, really huge systemic issues. We have a government that has failed to close.
I think we're having some issues there with
bias.
Oh, Larissa, we lost you just on those
last. Can you hear me now?
We can, yeah. We lost you on those last few comments. You're saying the government who hasn't closed the gap, I think, is where you are going. Yeah,
the idea that we are a gap, or that this is a choice by governments to not enact the things that communities have been asking for decades. And so is my internet still struggling?
No, you're fine now, at least for me.
Fine now. I thought I'd just turn the video off. But so these governments have not come forward with the type of resourcing and needs that we've had for decades. Like, we're an incredibly wealthy nation. We've had 30 years of uninterrupted growth, but we have a social safety net that does not extend to everybody in this country. People do not have the same access to like our remote health services are asking for doctors right now. They're asking for beds. Yarrabah has 1 respirator and 400 people with already chronic lung issues. And they're trying to test 200 people that might potentially have coronavirus and trying to quarantine them. Like, we are so far behind the 8 ball because governments have refused to give us the adequate services that we need. I forget what your other part of the question was.
It was really around like what folk here could do leaving this call.
I think it is, one, people need to understand that we're not sick because we made ourselves sick. These are decisions, and when you don't have the resourcing to be better, when you don't have the housing, everyone deserves access to a safe home. When you don't have that in communities, when you don't have access to doctors, when there isn't a hospital, what are you going to do when you're sick? How are people supposed to travel? You know, you're locking down the Northern Territory, but the hospitals are in Katherine and Darwin and Alice Springs. So where are the beds in remote communities? And that's a really urgent and critical question that needs to be answered right now. And quite frankly, Scott Morrison hasn't come out and answered that. You know, he's doing a lot, and I understand that people are appreciative of what the government is putting out, but every time I see Pat Turner or a doctor or someone from one of the ACOs coming out and saying, we need this thing, I'm just like, why do we have to ask for this thing? Like, the idea that APY lenses are saying we need to move our elders. We have to be able to move our elders somewhere safe to be being quarantined because they are the most at risk. Like, our elders, they don't retire. They're not just elderly people. They are leaders in our community. They hold our knowledge. They are very important. We already deal with the gap in life expectancy, and we have so few left. And it is completely reasonable that communities across the country are saying, give us a quarantine and isolation area to send people to keep them safe. You can't keep people safe in overcrowded houses right now. And that's what we're dealing with. And the government actually needs to front up and answer the calls, because that is a reasonable request. Like, we know that people need to stay in communities. The young people, there's been tremendous work done around translating public health messages. There was an amazing amount of sports stars that came out and kind of brought to attention of young people that they need to respect elders and that they need to take this seriously, but also they need to explain to elders what's happening. But actually the government needs to respond. And also I think our media is not doing a really good job of representing the stories that are coming out of communities right now. The amount of people I've talked to who have tried to raise the issue with local and national media around what is happening in their community right now, and they're not getting cut through. There are so many stories, and I think that we need to focus on the communities that are most at risk right now.
Great. I had a question come through in the chat that I kind of wanted to pose to you as well, which is Russell Johnson had asked whether or not he was a bit worried and I guess was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on whether or not COVID had sucked the oxygen out of gathering momentum for better positioning of First Nations people. You know, obviously we've talked a little bit about how First Nations people are interacting with or trying to deal with this crisis, but looking at this over the next year or two, as much as any of us can predict that far ahead, you know, do you think that we're going to be able to snap back to some of the momentum that we had? Are we going to have to do some things differently to kind of regain that? I don't know what your thoughts are.
I mean, this is the thing, like, we've been fighting for these things for decades. I work in this space because I know that all the health services and the education services that we have at home were put in place by my elders. So we, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, will always keep and continue to fight for this thing. And I think if we do really see, history shows us that pandemics across Australia have not been felt evenly. Like, when we look at the outbreak of smallpox, of influenza, I asked the other day, I was asking some people that if they could tell in the community that they live in, when the Spanish influenza broke out over 100 years ago, how many people died? Do you know? Because right now there are so many people in Aboriginal communities across the country that can answer that question, because they have these stories within their communities. They understand that this is really scary. This is really, like, we have to take serious measures here. So I think actually right now there is a responsibility on Australians to make sure that the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are elevated right now, and that, you know, people are explaining that we understand that the elderly are a huge frontline right now and people with chronic illness, but people need to actually, like, spread the message that it is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are also included in this. Like, the idea that the same health advice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is for people that is 15 and 20 years younger than the general public health. That shows that there is a massive gap here, and a massive disadvantage, and people are sicker, and that people need to take that seriously. Like, people need to understand that they can't just go traveling around in and around Aboriginal communities and come from outside, because they pose a risk to our communities right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a thought that had occurred to me was that there's a cruel echo of our past when it comes to the idea of an influenza being brought to Australia, being brought to this land by foreign people, and it disproportionately affecting the people who are here. And I think I feel a personal sense of responsibility to try and stop that being disproportionately felt. I'm just going to do like a last round of open questions for Larissa, and I do encourage everyone to pop some of them in there. I know I have 100 questions, but you know, I don't want to be the centre of attention here. You all should be, and this is a really good opportunity to pose them to some really wonderful people. But I might now actually just turn to June and kind of have a quick chat with you, and then we'll kind of come back to open questions for everybody. So June, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. And in addition to some of Malarndirri's comments, I think we have a real privilege of hearing from you, who is actually living out west, not stuck in the city like I certainly am, and like many of the people on the call are. What have you been seeing and hearing, and how are communities out there responding?
Yeah, so I don't actually live out west. So I live in New South Wales, and I live on the north coast.
Oh,
so I'm Bunja country. I'm actually a Dunghutti woman. So that's the Kempsey, Nambucca, Coffs Harbour region. But over the last many years, I've travelled extensively across Australia. And, as we would say at FPDN, there is no more vulnerable Australia today than, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person living with disability. And that phase came back from our founding elder, Uncle Lester Bostock, who was a man that lived with disability. And he wrote about this way back in the early 90s, about double disadvantage. Being Aboriginal and having a disability is such a disadvantage in Australia today. You have to choose between, getting your disability supports or being supported as an Aboriginal person. And that's the unconscious bias that happens across Australia today. The recognition and particularly now, there's heightened anxiety in our communities. We already know there's, huge numbers of mental health and psychosocial disability. And at this stage, with heightened areas of anxiety around, trying to keep safe, living in overcrowded houses, not having, the service sector supporting you. This is, just coming home now to, create more issues in our communities. I wanted to go back to an earlier question about the Army. And I think there is a place for them, and that's in regards to supports and equipment and services. So as Larissa said, our medical centres across the region are not equipped. We're hearing over and over again they don't have personal protection equipment. They don't have testing equipment. And in regards to, the government's talked about setting up 100 respiratory clinics nationally across regions. But, how will these be set up when people don't have the equipment, don't have the facilities? We've already heard that there's only 2,000 respiratory support units across Australia, when we have such a huge population. So, our concern right at the moment is the ethical issues around ICU and triage. So if you're an Aboriginal person with a disability and, you have other chronic health conditions, will you be triaged out at a major hospital because you don't, you won't have the same recuperation as somebody that may not have these. So that's a real issue that we're actually writing a paper now on this to be launched next week around the human rights issues around triage. We've already seen it play out in the US and in England. So, it's a real concern for us. And getting back to, you know, the remote communities, people with disability, who's out there supporting them? You know, like if the carers go down, how isolated are they? We know the housing is, you know, overcrowded already. So, and the service sector are not getting into these communities. So how are their medical or personal or social supports being, you know, supported if, you know, the community can't do that, you know, because they don't have the, you know, even just food supplies. We've heard, you know, stocks from weeks ago, you know, up in Tenor Creek, the shelves are all empty. You know, you can't even get the basic supplies across communities. So these are the things I think metropolitan people need to realise. And then if you're, you know, a person with disability, you have less access to these, you know, goods and equipment generally. So I think there's a lot of conversations that, you know, the government still needs to have. It goes back to what Larissa said, you know, we're not getting any media coverage at all whatsoever into, you know, what's happening out in our communities, the real issues that are happening out there, you know, who, you know, yes, you know, there's been extra funding for mental health, but if you can't get access to telehealth, if you're a person with disability that already has communication or physical implications in accessing these things, you know, telehealth means nothing to you. You know, it may be fine in a metropolitan region, you know, but if you don't have someone to support you to, you know, or you don't even have a telephone, what's the use of telehealth? So all these things, you know, the issues that we've acknowledged for a long, long time out in our communities are now coming home to, you know, realisation, and it's our people that will be, you know, disadvantaged across all these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, is there anything that you've seen from your work that, I guess as part of that fact that there hasn't been a lot of stories shared in the media, are there any kind of anecdotes that you've seen or heard about people's personal experiences that you could elevate in this conversation, just to give us a sense of what that lived experience looks like beyond what you already have?
Yeah, well, I can give you an example that, you know, I mean, we've got many coming in as Malarndirri. We're getting all the phone calls too. We're getting all the emails, you know, people concerned about, you know, their support's not happening. You know, an example was a young girl that lived on her own, and this only happened 2 weeks ago, with cerebral palsy, fell over and, you know, injured her ankle, so wasn't mobile, and laid in a house for 3 days on her own because the service sector, even though she was an NDIS recipient, the service sector wasn't, you know, servicing her. And finally, she was able to get to her telephone and ring 000 and get to a hospital. But these are the issues that we're really concerned about for people with disability, you know. If they don't have, you know, family around them, as Larissa said, family is separated now in all parts of the country, you know. And the other problem that we've seen with the stimulus package, you know, yes, you know, we love that initiative, it went out, but it didn't go across to people with disability. They got a one-off payment, but we're saying, you know, that payment should be, you know, as regards to the other stimulus package, should be a weekly payment, because their needs now are even heightened. You know, we see, particularly in rural and remote, the cost of, you know, general living supplies, food and, you know, personal supports have almost doubled in a lot of regional areas. So, and then, you know, even just getting their personal, you know, hygiene equipment, you know, all these things are costing more money. So people with disability were disadvantaged before this, and now they're even more disadvantaged.
I guess that's a nice, interesting point of crossover into a bit of a different topic, but do you think that now is the time that we might be able to, you know, push for the kind of significant reform to the NDIS that we've needed, or that the money that has been pledged but hasn't been delivered might actually start to come through?
And that's, you know, some of the work we've just been doing in the last 2 weeks. So all the Coalition of Disability Peaks put a letter together this week to Cabinet asking for our wants. We have not been answered at this stage. Again, none of the media has picked up on that. So that just shows you that, you know, the unconscious bias in regards to people with disability in Australia, let alone being an Aboriginal person with disability. The other ask that we've had was that unpaid carers through the NDIS, so family members should be able to be paid at this time if the original carers, you know, from the service sector aren't able to get into community or be able to facilitate, you know, access into people's homes. So we're saying, you know, family members, which is should be able to be paid at this time and some sort of supplement or carer allowance. The other ask we've had with the NDIS, before COVID happened, they were going to instigate 41 Aboriginal community connectors nationally to support people to connect better with the NDIS. We're asking now for those community connectors to be released and out in community to support better people to connect to whatever, you know, their personal or other needs may be.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. In our last sort of 15 minutes together, I thought I'd start by, we've had a whole bunch of wonderful questions come through while we've been chatting. I thought I might just actually open this up, and no pressure if you guys haven't, but to see if June, Larissa or Malarndirri, if you have any thoughts, comments or reflections on what you've heard from each other. I think you've all had really interesting and different perspectives, and I was wondering if perhaps in hearing from each other that triggered some thoughts in your mind.
Well, I think, you know, for me, you know, as Larissa pointed out earlier, you know, we are the thought leaders. You know, we've survived everything that's been thrown at us for, you know, whatever it may be for many years. Now is the time, you know, to, you know, speak to Aboriginal people, speak to our leaders across the sector, whether they're, you know, in medical or across disability, in all areas, and ask what, you know, needs to be in the community. I mean, there are human rights violations happening here. You know, I mean, we need to ask what's happening in our justice system. We know through Human Rights Watch, you know, more than half the people, you know, interned in our justice areas are people with disability. You know, who is supporting them at this time? You know, the anxiety levels must be so high when you're in incarceration. You know, what are happening to the 10 and 14-year-olds in the Northern Territory? You know, I know there's one now in Alice Springs that's incarcerated and because of the lockdown won't have his hearing to October now. And it's his first, you know, criminal record, and he stole 2 bikes. Really, should he be locked up? These are the questions, you know, that need to be put out there across media. That young fella, you know, how hard must it be for him to be interned and away from his family at this time? And as we know, you know, we've seen with the cruise ships and everywhere else, you know, in smaller isolated settings, the virus is more rampant to, you know, spread across areas.
I was just going to say, June, as well, just on that issue, happy to talk more with you offline on that too, because I'd like to be aware of some of those issues, and I know you can't go into it publicly at the moment, but yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think there's a broader picture in terms of policy overall, whether COVID's here or not, about our young people in jails across the country, and particularly here in the Northern Territory. I do want to pick up on what June also said, Daniel, around food security. That is clearly a major concern, certainly for Northern Australia. One thing I've said on numerous Aboriginal media outlets and radio shows is that it matters what happens in the south, because all of our supplies pretty much come from South Australia and Victoria, and some from WA up. So any of the panic buying that people were doing, I think it's starting to calm a bit, but that does impact in terms of access. But the other thing I want to point out with it too is that we've got to keep vigilant about the stores in these communities. And I have been talking to different stores across the territory in terms of prices. And I'm sure people are seeing it in other respective states and territories as well, that not to use this as an opportunity to just put prices through the roof, because that is not the way to go either. So these are things that we have to keep going on. And if I could just conclude and just say, whilst I just have the attention of everyone, because I'll probably have to jump off soon for a Senate committee hearing, can I just say a huge thank you to all of those people who are on the front line for us. Our health workers, our educators, and the ones who have to be in there every single day, still out there, and to the land councils and the Aboriginal Medical Services. I'm just so proud of our First Nations organisations in particular, but more broadly, the wider society in terms of trying to see what we can do. But there is no doubt, as I said from the outset, that the fundamental problems facing First Nations people have been there for decades, and this virus and this pandemic has just highlighted on such a level just how wide that gap is, and things have to seriously change from here on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful to have had you.
Thank you.
Larissa, do you have any thoughts? Sadly, we're going to lose Malarndirri, but I'd be interested to hear your reflections on the conversation we've had too.
I think that there is an issue as well. I just want to touch on the idea of, Auntie June, this is stuff that she says to me. I have a young Aboriginal brother with cerebral palsy, and I understand what people are going through with the NDIS because my mother is going through it, and it is really, really challenging for people with disabilities who are Aboriginal right now. I think that the issue of homelessness and disadvantage, it is exacerbated in this, but also the idea that things could go wrong, the idea that over-policing right now, right across the country, could impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. When I talk to people on phones about what's happening in the measures around having the army there, around having more federal police, it's an important measure. But we're not waiting with any bated breath. We know that this could go wrong. And so I think that there's a tension there of you're on the verge of waiting to see what happens with the pandemic. People are already sick, but you also know we are now in a situation where there are more police than ever in and around our people, and that is incredibly scary for us. I think that, even for young mob who are, homeless, who have a lot of other issues that are more important to them than COVID right now, the idea that they can be stopped by the police, the idea that these biosecurity laws, if there is a pandemic outbreak, are tasked with keeping people in communities, there are so many ways that this could go wrong, and we need to remain vigilant and actually be smart about. I did hear a report, the NT Chief Police Officer a couple of weeks ago was talking about how they had broken up a gathering on a town camp outside of Alice Springs. And the way that was reported by the Chief Police Officer was that this was a terrible thing to be happening, that community members needed to be more responsible, and that, there was an issue with police, sorry, my internet connection. There was an issue with community members then becoming aggressive at police. First of all, the ability for our communities right now and the work that is being done by frontline organisations to try and translate public health information to communities who do not speak English as a first language is an incredible task. And it is taking a long time, and for a lot of these organisations, there is not a direct link of information as it is changing coming directly from government. So they're having to source the information themselves and then do a lot of work going out and translating and making sure people understand that. When the lockdowns happened under the biosecurity laws, there was a rush and panic across many places to get people out on country. And that was led by community organisations who just had to drop everything and make sure people could get home. There were people who were stranded in that. There was a lot of confusion. A lot of people were out on country and didn't understand that the public health information around social distancing. And so what you had was police coming into the community, breaking up a gathering, and community members know that when they're out in those town camps, there is rules around, and they have some standards around how the police should come and interact with them. So for a police to come in heavy-handed and say, we're breaking this up, for them to not understand what's going on, people need to understand that there is there is a situation here that could get out of hand. And so I think that part of it is incumbent on police to actually have the right linkages with communities and to be talking to people before acting so heavily handed and saying that, people aren't breaking laws if they don't understand what the laws are. That's the end of story. but we have to make sure that our communities are safe within that. And that means that there needs to be more linkages from government, from police, from health sectors with people who are on the front line who can explain to communities what's going on.
Thanks. That is an extremely interesting point, and a really, really interesting insight. I'm just going to pull up a couple of questioners, and I'll begin with calling upon Danny Fadul, who has a really interesting question for the panel.
Thanks so much for that, Daniel, and thank you, panelists. My question is, to what extent will remote communities have to undertake physical isolation for longer than other communities because of the fragility and lack of health services, overcrowded housing, and the like?
I mean, I don't think they will, you know, hope that the best outcome is it doesn't get out into our communities. I mean, it seems to be a more metropolitan issue at the moment because people are not self-isolating here, you know. So the best scenario that we hope and pray that it doesn't, you know, get into our communities. So I can't see they would have to self-isolate any longer. I mean, if there's, you know, those with extenuating chronic or other disability health issues that may impact, you know, I think, you know, people need to, you know, discuss with them about different options, how they can be supported. I mean, another initiative we'd like the government to take up is some paid cultural navigators, what Larissa was talking about, that translation, but they need to be paid positions to support the community to understand, you know. All of these things don't happen for nothing. And, you know, in any other language or any other sector, these positions are paid for, and they should be paid across our areas to get that, you know, the right communication out there.
I think the other thing too, so Scott Morrison and actually out of the National Cabinet, so any measure put in by government needs to stay in place for 6 months for it to work. One of the things that that you might be seeing from different places overseas and hear reports about is the idea of this second wave. So obviously, once people start re-emerging, that's going to be an issue. So I think from talking to Aboriginal controlled health organisations, there's an advice that basically these communities might stay in lockdown a little bit longer with the second wave as well. And so that's one of the precautions that people are thinking and talking about. But it's also one of the reasons why people across like Yarrabah and the Kimberley are asking for the tests that they can basically turn around a result in 45 minutes, because Aboriginal communities need to know really fast if the coronavirus is in community, because they don't have many resources with health. They don't have areas to isolate. So they need to get it under control very, very fast if they have it. So that's why they were asking. There are organisations across the country that are actually going outside of government asking for PPE, asking philanthropists to donate money to bring in resources from other places, because they need to be able to test people across communities. And we know the reason that they can't test people at a volume that needs to be tested because there is no PPE. So there is also this thing around what Auntie June was talking about triage, is like, actually there is, we know our communities carry a health burden that's 2.5 times the national average, and that means that we should have 2.5 times the allocation of essential services and need within communities. That's just the baseline of what we're already dealing with. Coronavirus is on top of that. So we need above and beyond. When Auntie June was talking about the respirators and all this sort of stuff, that needs to be allocated proportionately to the risk.
Yeah. That makes sense. I guess an extension question, which riffs off something that somebody has private messaged me and asked me to pose on their behalf because their work context has some sensitivities around it. But this person has heard through their work that a number of the Indigenous communities that they've dealt with have felt like they're a bit of a lost cause, and that the government's just kind of stepped back and is focusing on middle-class suburbanites instead, with a really visceral example of sort of large amounts of body bags being moved out to these communities ahead of a potential need. I guess, that was just a powerful anecdote to have been shared with me. But secondly, I guess the question part of that is that, you know, have you guys heard about that? Do you know if that that attitude or emotional response is commonly felt, or if there's anything we can kind of do to make sure that that isn't what's being delivered from a response kind of perspective?
So I can answer this as well. I have been, and I'm not going to identify the organisations that I have been talking to, because there are issues around their government funding and stuff like that, and there are certain things that they can't say. We know that if this pandemic reaches our communities, it will be devastating, and that is a whole nother level where the rest of the country is thinking, like, how do we recover from this? If it gets into our communities, we need to deal with the trauma of what that looks like. And that's, I don't want to go into talking about that, but people are really talking about what it means to set up temporary morgues and all this sort of, I think that's a horrible thing to think about, but that's not a defense. That's not a defense that is coming from that makes people feel like governments are giving up. And I've been part of a number of conversations where people are really frustrated that that's part of the thing that they have to discuss right now. Instead of being like, give us the doctors, give us the respirators, that actually the conversation is open at that point. And it is true, it is happening. And it's incredibly sobering, and it's something that we don't want to talk about, but I also don't think this is the thing that we should go out and be talking to, because I also don't want to scare our community around this stuff. But it's a realistic, if people don't have the things to make them better, we know what this virus does. And we know, just even at looking at the numbers of death rates in the US, in Louisiana, that people who are poor, people who have chronic illness, people who are Black have died at a rate that is higher than the other population. There's no way that that's going to be different here.
And you're welcome to, if you...
And I think, this is why it's a timely reminder. Systemically, we're trying to, ensure that the government recognises their responsibilities, in regards to the CRPD, the Human Rights Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So there's a few new papers that'll be coming out around that. And I think that's the only way we need to come into the government, to remind them of their responsibilities. There are human rights violations happening here. We know they haven't done it before this, but, if we can get some media around this when we release these papers, that's the only way to, we're already speaking to Human Rights Watch and other entities to, speak to the government and release papers around, what are the obligations of our governments. So we're not again, regarded or as second-class citizens. And that's that unconscious bias I wrote about earlier. People unconsciously, even the fact that person texts that, I'm quite offended personally as an Aboriginal person. I know they're asking the question on behalf because that conversation happened within, but, in Australia today, people are still having those sort of comments. It's quite offensive, really. And that would be my comment back to that person,
Thank you, yeah. We're right up against time, so there's two quick tasks I want to do before we close. One is there's been a lot of challenging stuff we've discussed today, and I think it's been really insightful, but I'm actually going to ask both June and Larissa if you could actually share something that you've been really happy or impressed about, something that you've seen about the way that the folk you've been talking to and connecting with have done that has made you actually really smile and feel really proud. Before we come back to that, I'll give you a few moments to think about it. I just wanted to both thank you both and to thank Malarndirri because you've all been incredible. Somebody in the chat earlier mentioned it was great to hear from such three incredibly strong female leaders, and I 100% echo that. I also wanted to encourage everyone to do the feedback sheet. We share that at the end of each of these sessions over email. Please, just even if it's just like a quick out of 10 score and some comments, it's really helpful for us just to make sure that these sessions fine tune and get a bit better. So yeah, for no reason other than just to make the quality better for you. The next thing I wanted to comment on too is this Sunday, we're also doing an Easter reflection. So I'm not of faith, but I know many of you are. I know lots of people in this community are. But even not being of a faith community in this strange time, the idea of thinking about our larger life purpose is certainly something I've been very attracted to. So we're having Tim Costello join Reverend Dr. Josephine Inkpen. We're having Grant Poulsen, who is also a First Nations leader and developmental expert. We're having the Centre for Public Christianity's Justine Toe, ethicist, theologian, and honorary associate for the Centre of Disability Research at UCID, Shane Clifton. Have a quick chat to Brad Chilcott, who some of you might have seen earlier on in this week, last week in fact, about the role of the church in the modern world, and also some live music from Liv Watson. So an incredibly bumper edition on Sunday. And then we're back next Tuesday with Essential and The Guardian's reflection on the mood of the nation, the political geek fest, as Peter likes to call it, where they run through the most recent findings of the Essential Research Report. And then a whole bunch of things coming later that week, which we'll send you all an email about. So that's the last little bit from me. So thank you again to you guys. And if I could throw over to you to share those anecdotes, and then once you're finished, we'll wrap up. So I don't know, June, it looks like your thing is highlighted. So what's something that's made you smile? What's something you've been really impressed by over the last couple of weeks?
I think, once again, our communities have stepped up and, has shared, and I've seen that across many media outlets where people are sharing, whatever little they had or reaching out. I mean, we did a webinar yesterday with an Aboriginal counsellor that, supports communities so strongly. And on his own back, he's been driving up and down the coast when he could, or ringing around and making sure people are all right. So these are the things that our mob do well. We know how to reach out. We know how to network. We don't wait to be asked. I mean, I've just seen in my own community up here in Nambucca Heads, there's no fighting over toilet paper down the aisles. Everyone's really orderly. And I think what I want to leave it with, my 92-year-old uncle rang me last night and he goes, "Have you got fish, Dort, for Good Friday?" And I went, "Oh no, not yet, Uncle," and he goes, "Well, the mob just dropped off a whole load to me. I'll bring some around." And I think that's what we do well, we're the leaders in diversity, and sharing and helping each other. And I think, but we still need to help up with, the basic things like Larissa was saying earlier, the shortages in community where we can't access it. That's where others need to support us, because we'll share it. We've got access to, any goods or equipment. We'll share with each other and make sure it goes round. And I just wanted to leave it there. And thank you for today.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I think that it's the same thing. Like for me, even growing up as a young person, like in a community with a very, we grew up in a very strong sense of community. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of the comments that I see from my other friends, it's like, this is the best sense of community that I've ever had going through this thing. I'm like, no, we've always had this. Do you know what I mean? A crisis doesn't make us treat each other like this. And I really love, like, even seeing the younger generation, like, making TikToks with all their families and that sort of stuff. And just like, people sharing their culture. There's been like online weaving and stuff like that. But I really take my hats off to all the Aboriginal frontline organisations in community, just the people who are just leading, and they're leading for us. And that gives me an incredible amount of hope right now, regardless of what happens. That makes me feel like whatever happens, we can get through this. We absolutely do need some really big and urgent help, but we have a structure there that the government can work with, and that is willing to work with government, and they need to come to the party.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the people who've joined us as well. You've been absolutely wonderful. And I think the conversation in the chat has been really good. So have a wonderful long weekend, and we'll see you all next week, if not on Sunday.
Thank you.